want to say welcome to everyone. Welcome to this session that is sponsored by the Carl Spain Center on Race Studies and Spiritual Action. We are so excited that you decided to join us today for a session of book review and insights from Dr. Fred Aquino. But before we jump into that, I always want to take time and hear a starting word from the founding director of the Carl Spain Center, Dr. Jerry Taylor. Dr. Taylor?
Thank you, Byron. It's a pleasure to join in this meeting with you all today, and we appreciate you taking time to listen to what I think will be a very insightful presentation from our dear friend, Dr. Fred Aquino. As we all know and realize that we're in some very serious times, and where we really need to keep the lines of communication open, no matter how frustrated we may become with each other. We still need to maintain the human capability of communicating and conversing with one another, and not shutting down and withdrawing and canceling each other. And so we are fortunate to have Fred with us today to help us to think around the book that he has recommended, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And sometimes it seems like conversations are very impossible to have with some people, and I'm sure people think that way about me and others as well. But I think Fred's presentation will be beneficial for us all. So I'll toss it back to you, Byron, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Well, we're excited that you're here with us today, and I'll keep mentioning that because I think the work that the Carl Spain Center is doing through these sessions, through these events, is incredibly powerful and impactful, but it's part of a form of spiritual formation that we want to stay connected to as it helps lead and ground us for the work that's coming ahead. Dr. Fred Aquino is here with us today that's going to review a book. Dr. Aquino has his PhD from Southern Methodist University, an MA from Abilene Christian University, an MDiv from Abilene Christian University, and a BA from Abilene Christian University. I could go through all of his books and publications, but it would take a while, and that's time that we could be using in the session. So I won't do that, but you can go and look that up at acu.edu and look for it on the Bible Department's page. You can also look for other upcoming events that the Carl Spain Center will be doing on the same website, acu.edu/Carl Spain. One of the things we want to do is housekeeping today. As we go through our time today, Dr. Aquino has asked that if you have questions as you're going through, put those in the chat, but he will not take care of those. He will not answer those until the end of the presentation. That's so he can make it through the presentation without any hiccups. And so if you address those directly to me and or address those directly to the Carl Spain Center, we will hold those questions to the end and make sure Dr. Aquino has time to address those questions at the end. We're going to ask that it's easy to get distracted as we're on this Zoom platform. We're going to ask that you stay keyed in, stay tuned in to the information that's being shared today. And at the end, like I said, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Thank you for being with us today. And without any further ado, Dr. Fred Aquino.
Again, I want to thank Jerry and the committee for asking me to be a part of this today. It's a really difficult topic. It's a timely topic. And I just want to reiterate what was said. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. I'm almost 58, so maybe that's what it is. But I will not be able to look at your chat while I'm talking. And even last week when I was listening to the presentations, I was not looking at the chat. I was listening to the presentations. So what happened last time, I didn't get to answer some of the questions that were posed in the chat. And once it was over, the session was over, we lost that. So if you have questions and we don't get to them today, email me. I'll be glad to respond to your questions. Okay, so the focus today is a book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, a very practical guide. And it's a really practical book. It almost reads like an outline, and it goes through, it looks at 36 different techniques that have been used professionally, anything from how to interrogate someone, interrogate's probably the wrong way, how to negotiate with someone, somebody who's a professional negotiator, how to do things like that with respect to deep and difficult conversations. So I won't review the whole book, but I'll highlight what I think are really important facets of the book. Now, just to be clear, both of these writers, I think if you go back and look at their background, I think they're both atheists. And I think they also, about 2 years ago, had what was called the so-called hoax part 2, which is they submitted to various journals, 20 publications, to various journals, saying the most outrageous things, but using the sort of coded language that's used today. And those were published. In fact, one of those essays won the best article of the year, and they deliberately articulated ridiculous and ludicrous ideas, but used the sort of trendy language. And I think what they were trying to show is sometimes when we use language, we're not really clear what we mean by it, and we're not really clear what reasons led us to the particular positions that we have. So they're very controversial. The IRB at Portland State disciplined Peter Boghossian because he didn't go through the protocol of IRB. I'm on IRB here at ACU. And so, but what he was trying to illustrate is when you write to these journals and you try to publish in these journals, sometimes you can get away with saying things that are just bizarre, incredible, incoherent. And so the book starts out with, I won't use the exact language, but the book starts out with conversing with an a-hole. And it tries to, it starts out with Peter Boghossian as the a-hole, which is to say that he perhaps learned in his own experience that sometimes you can be so committed to being right or so committed to what you consider to be the truth that you don't really hear out a person. You don't really pursue conversation. You don't really pursue legitimate dialogue. And so the book in some ways is an attempt to step back, given the current situation, to step back and say, what are the conditions under which people can have real conversations? That's the main question of the book, I think. And so they describe this work as an applied epistemology. Epistemology is just a theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What are the conditions under which we know things? They're not doing that in this book. They're not trying to lay out the theoretical issues related to how one knows something or what the nature of knowledge is. Actually, they're just trying to apply principles that they think are appropriate to the evaluation of beliefs that one might have. How do you intervene in the cognition of others is maybe another way they put it, and spell out the path to truth seeking. So again, the book is heavy on the practical side. And if you buy it and read it, and I would recommend that you read it. It's a really good practical guide for how to engage people in legitimate conversation. And with great clarity, I think they offer techniques in which we learn to listen, or we learn to understand the meaning of what it means to actually listen to someone, what it means to understand what somebody else is saying. I also think the book, they don't say this, but I think it's related to my last talk. I think this book is a work in intellectual formation. That is, there are certain qualities that we need to have if we're going to engage in dialogue or conversation, particularly open-mindedness, humility, rigor, love of the truth, patience. There are so many others I could list, but these are all really important aspects. And as anyone knows that has tried to cultivate these, what I call intellectual virtues, they don't happen overnight. You have to learn how to inhabit a particular world in which you cultivate these characteristics over time. I haven't submitted it, but I will be glad to submit to Jerry and others a list of virtues that I use in my classes. That in the syllabus, we agree to these virtues before the semester begins, and because it's important for students to see that in order to have conversations in class, we have to learn to cultivate a certain mindset, a certain perspective. So a robust account of intellectual formation, it seems to me, requires the right kinds of dispositions. And I think this book tries to highlight some of those without using the language of virtue. However, you can be open-minded and still be wrong. So the point is not that if you're open-minded, you're always right, or if you're humble, you're always right, or if you care about the truth, you always succeed in getting the truth, because you can have the right motivations, the right desires, but you may not necessarily achieve the goal. However, it's probably more likely the case that you're going to make more progress when you incorporate these kinds of practices into your own thinking and into your own way. So an example would be, I can desire to be a philosopher all day long, and if I don't know how to make arguments and I don't know how to evaluate arguments, my desire is merely that, it's a desire, right? So in other words, we can desire meaningful conversations all day long. We can desire to get at the truth all day long, but there's a difference between having the desire for something and actually having the capacity or the ability. So this book, I think, isn't merely saying, hey, be a nice person, be open-minded, be humble, listen. I think they are interested in seeing how that kind of desire or those desires link to the evaluation of whatever beliefs you have on the table. So another assumption of the book is this book wants people, or wants to allow people to reach out to people with whom they disagree. And I know that sounds really basic and obvious, but I think it is no longer a given. I think it's pretty obvious in our time that if you say a particular thing, you could be easily blown off. You could be easily written off as a liberal, as a conservative. Just fill in whatever words you can think of. Because I think we've coded each other, or we've insulated ourselves from real scrutiny. And I think the book is designed to say, if that's the case, then we're not going to make much progress. We're just going to hibernate in our own worldview, perspective, and we're going to assign the worst motives and capacities and desires to individuals with whom we disagree. The book is described as a practical tool book or simple tool book. But these authors, if you know a little bit about their history and you can read between the lines, they are by far or by no means hiding who they are. They're certainly not conservative politically, but I think by bringing that out in the book in the earlier part and telling stories about themselves, what they're trying to say is this book isn't just for you, it's for them, it's for everyone, right, including the authors themselves. So in other words, they're applying their own method to their own perspective. But this is not to say the authors, again, don't have an agenda. They do. They clearly are known for their grievance studies affair, which was the hoax I was talking about. And one of the reviewers of this book, who certainly would not be on their side, was honest enough to say the book's still worth reading. Which is to say, you can disagree with an author, you might even have questions about particular aspects of their thinking, but we want to find out if what they're saying makes sense, right? And if you say, well, you can't read this book if you're a conservative, or you can't read this book if you're a liberal, you can't read this book, again, fill in the blank, what you've done is you've shot down discourse, all because of what I would consider, and the authors of this book would consider, to be a kind of moral superiority, right? Whoever's on my side is a morally good person. Whoever's on the other side is a really bad person, or a horrific person, or a vicious person. And I think the book doesn't do this, but I will. I will distinguish between what I would call moral virtues, that is the virtues related to living the good life, and intellectual virtues, that is the virtues related to living the intellectual life. So you could be a really intellectually virtuous person with respect to your ability to think and not be the best person on the planet. And there are plenty of examples in history of individuals who were brilliant, but were morally flawed. And we're now beginning to see people push the envelope on that question. Should you read so-and-so because they had this moral flaw in their life? And as I said in the last talk, if we look in the mirror, we won't have many people that will be reading any particular writers when we think about that. And then there is certainly a spectrum on that. How far do you go? How far do you go on the moral spectrum? How far do you go on the intellectual spectrum? And what the authors in this book are trying to do is they're trying to pull apart a little bit, I think, initially, the difference between a belief and an action, right? So I may have certain beliefs that you evaluate and say, oh yeah, those make great sense. Dr. Aquino he's on our side. He's for this and that. And then privately, I may engage in behavior that's, let's just say, problematic. Now, I'm not saying I have or I plan to, but my point would be I could come to work and go and teach a philosophy class and do it really well and still be morally suspect as a person, maybe a deadbeat dad. I'm not, I think. I think my kids would say I'm not. But let's say I am. I don't think that would invalidate my intellectual work in the classroom necessarily, unless I'm doing something illegally on campus, right? And so what the book tries to do is it tries to pull apart a little bit the moralizing that comes with recent discourse. So with that in mind, let's think about the opening section, conversing with an a-hole. Both the authors are the first to accept that they bring their own perspective to any conversation, as we all do. The task, however, is to resist the temptation to dismiss, misrepresent, and denigrate people, that is, our conversation partners, if they don't share our particular perspective. A sociologist sent me a link, Daniel Morrison, and if you want, I can share that, showing that I think the stats were over 60% of college students are not comfortable speaking up in class because they feel like they'll be blasted. They feel like there will be an ideological bullet coming their way. And I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that research is correct. I will say intuitively, I've noticed a difference in students when they feel that a professor's out to get them, even though it may not be the case, they'll shut down. And getting them into conversation, in my estimation, is becoming more and more difficult because nobody wants to sound stupid and nobody wants to sound like they're immoral, right? Nobody wants to be called a particular word to say that they're a morally problematic person. And in fact, it seems to me that we can all succumb to the temptation to assassinate people, morally speaking. And I think the book is trying to caution us against that. They mercilessly highlight their particular errors in the book, their mistakes. They will actually give stories without giving names, I think, showing a dialogue that each author has had. And I quote, this is with respect to Peter, one of the authors, "He wasn't listening. He was annoying. He was being an a-hole. He was so focused on winning and even intellectually embarrassing this person in his department that he ruined the conversation and closed the door to productive future exchanges." So that's beginning of the book. It highlights the dialogue. And again, Peter Boghossian is not a conservative. He was having a discussion with a feminist liberal about a particular issue. And the way it goes is he was so wanting to go after the truth of it, which I don't think is a bad motive necessarily, but in being so quick to do that, he was not really listening to the person with whom he was having a dialogue, or not really a dialogue, not even a discussion, right? A monologue. And I know we have never been guilty of that, ever. We've never been guilty of being so correct in our assumptions that we know before we even listen what we're going to say, right? You ever had that experience? You know exactly what you want to say. In fact, you will allow the person to complete their sentence in terms of what is observable, but in your mind, you've already completed the sentence. And in fact, I had a student years ago in class who actually completed the sentence of another student, and the student called that individual an a-hole right in my class. And it got really quiet. And I thought, well, yeah, you did do that. You did complete the sentence for the other student, which tells me you thought you knew exactly what that person was going to say. And you probably already had an argument or an evaluation in your mind set to go. So we can't help it sometimes, the way our brains work. But I think the point of the book is we perhaps now need to think of techniques or strategies for having conversations. And again, I think the point of this book is get away from the truth, get away from truth seeking. I don't think that's at all what these authors are saying. I think they're saying there are conditions under which truth seeking has to happen. And if not, then it ends up becoming a monologue, or you end up assassinating a person intellectually or morally. And I think the end of their book is really quite interesting. So the purpose of the book is to focus on the conditions under which we can communicate effectively with people who hold radically different beliefs. Not just they differ with us a little bit, but they differ from us in radical ways. The context, I think, of the book is a divided and polarized world in which common ground is difficult to come by. I think that is not too far from the truth, if I'm being honest. And I think also there's a fear of speaking openly and honestly. I think people are now afraid to say what they really think. They don't want to. In fact, these authors said they've been contacted by plenty of people, and 95% of them said, "Thanks for writing this book, but I can't recommend it and endorse it publicly because I would be criticized and perhaps ostracized." That's a tragedy in my mind when that happens. No matter how much I disagree with a book or like it, when I review books, my rule is to figure out what the author's asking, to figure out what the author's trying to say, to figure out whether the author's been successful in achieving the stated goals, rather than saying the author didn't write the book I wanted to write, therefore it's a bad book. Actually, to write a book that's clear with stated goals and questions and lines of argumentation, I could disagree with the conclusion and still say it's a really good book, right? So this is, I think, the point of the book that they're trying to get across is how do you have these conversations? How do you have impossible conversations, right? How to have impossible conversations. Quote, conversations that seem futile because they take place across a seemingly unbridgeable gulf of disagreement in ideas, beliefs, morals, politics, or worldviews, end of quote. That's on page 3. Alternatively, for them, conversation, they assume, is collaborative. It creates opportunities for people to reconsider what they believe and thus potentially change how they believe, act, and so on. The aim here is not merely descriptive. That is, you're not merely describing what somebody believes or thinks, but you are also engaged in evaluating that with the person, right? That's why it's called the conversation. That's why it's collaborative. It requires both people to be engaged in the process of evaluation. And then another important point, this is a skill, or as I would say, a virtue, to be mastered or to be cultivated, and it really is more like a habit. So it's not something that happens overnight, right? Give me the pill that's going to help me to be a better thinker or a better conversation partner. This has to be done by thought and practice, by actually doing it. And that's why in the syllabus, I say to the students, the first day of class, here are the virtues. They have to agree to those virtues like a syllabus. It's a contract, right? There's an agreement. And so when we're in class and somebody is not hearing out another person, I'm not going to like punish them. I'm just going to remind them in some ways of the stated goals. In fact, first day of class, one thing I do, I don't have any class other than we go over the syllabus. I lay out my philosophy of education. I lay out the ground rules. I lay out the virtues. I clarify what I expect, and as opposed to what I don't expect, so they know exactly what they're coming into. And of course, they don't know what that's going to look like because we haven't gone through it. But I highly recommend that if you're a teacher or professor or a minister or in any profession where you have to communicate with others, that if there's some way to come to an agreement on how you're going to proceed, it doesn't guarantee everything, but what it does guarantee is you have some basic structures that you agree to and practices that are fairly accessible to individuals. Okay, so fundamentals. I'm not going to go through all the book because there's too much to cover, but I'm going to go through a few things that I think are really some points that I think are worth discussing and thinking about. So when you look at their fundamentals of a good conversation, the way the book is structured is it starts out with some very basic guidelines, and then once it's almost like learning a language. Once you master those or acquire efficiency in those basic skills, you then build on those, right? So if you take first year Greek and then intermediate Greek and then something above that, it's like math or languages. You have to get the basics, and then you build on the basics, and then you get a bit more complicated, you build on that, and that's the way the book is structured. So let me go through some of those that are what they consider to be basic guidelines or habits or fundamentals. So the first thing they say that you have to have in place are goals. I know that sounds boring. We have to do SLOs at ACU, and I'm sure other places, student learning outcomes. Like, what do we want students to get as a result of this class? What are we seeking to accomplish? And then we try to measure, and I'm not sure about that, but we do. We try to measure education. But the idea is we have some sort of goal or outcome in mind. And I think professors sometimes just put them down and don't think about it. And then they learn after the fact, oh, okay, I'm going to go back and restate maybe a bit more precisely because the student says in the evaluation, the professor didn't do X. And you're like, but I stated that my goal or one of my goals, right? One of my outcomes. So what are you seeking to accomplish in conversation? That seems like a really basic question. So are you seeking to acquire true rather than false beliefs? That's one goal. Are you seeking to avoid false beliefs, which is another goal? Are you seeking knowledge, which is another goal? Understanding, which is another goal? Wisdom, which is another goal? Learning from others, which is another goal? Winning, which is another goal? Or all of those? What are you seeking to accomplish in conversation? It's a very basic question that they say has to be thought about very carefully. What are you wanting to accomplish? And if we check ourselves at the door, I think we realize sometimes ego gets in the way. Who wants to be embarrassed in a conversation? Who wants to be shown that their understanding isn't quite right? The problem with that is, at least in my neck of the woods, in the academic world, that's the whole point. You have to go through criticism. You get feedback. You get your medicine, and you get it even when you're a seasoned scholar, if it's going the way it should. Because the goal is not to reward you with a stroke of your ego. It's to what? To get up to a better understanding of whatever the topic is. But I do think sometimes reviewers fall short of that. It's more about them. It's more about the book they wanted to write, or however you think about that. So what are the goals that you're seeking to accomplish when you're having a conversation? Secondly, do you see conversation as a partnership, or do you think that conversation needs to be sustained by compassion, empathy, respect, treating others as if you were working together in order to have a fruitful conversation? So conversation isn't simply about necessarily agreement or disagreement. That's going to come with conversations. It's also about civility, charity, and mutual understanding. However, civility does not mean that we must agree. So in other words, somebody might say, if you disagree with someone, they might say, well, you're not being civil. No, you can be very kind and very charitable and very nice and very open-minded and still state that maybe you don't see things exactly as your interlocutor sees those things. So civility, it just means having a kind of disposition in which you're not going to be a jerk. Or as the way the book starts out, you're not going to be an a-hole. You're not going to be a know-it-all. You're not going to stop people in the midst of their sentences in your mind or in reality when they're talking. You're going to actually hear them out. Which brings us to the next fundamental, which is trust or rapport. I find in my classes when I can get students, if they're small enough, around a table and I can get them to look at one another, they're less likely to take a quick shot at the other person because they have to look at the individual, they have to follow, and I'm there to make sure as a professor that the conduct in the class is actually in accordance with the stipulated goals that are laid out in the syllabus. So it seems to me when people feel like they can trust you, right? They know you have their back. They know you're not out to get them. They know you have what's best in mind for them. They're more likely to say what they think. If they feel like they're being set up, they feel like they're being manipulated, they feel like they're going to be a lesson for the class, they will shut down. Or they will say whatever needs to be said to keep the peace. The fourth fundamental is listening. I find that people feel deeply satisfied when they are heard. And we say that, right? We want to hear other voices. But I think this book says there's hearing what people say, and then there's assuming that I hear what you're saying. Really hearing out people. And if you cannot hear them, it's hard to, or listen to them, it's hard to understand someone, right? If all you can hear is what you think, then what you think is what you think they understand something to be the case, or that's what they believe, or that's how they understand it. So listening, in my mind, doesn't mean merely allowing different voices to be articulated, because it's easy. You can just say, okay, I'm going to let so-and-so X student talk. And in my mind, I've already closed my mind, but they're articulating words, right? And their voice is being heard. We're listening to what they're saying, but really, in essence, we're not. We're allowing words to be articulated. So the point here of the book is, if you really want to know what someone thinks, you have to hear out their point of view or their perspective. Number 5, don't deliver messages. That's their titles are very trendy. Shoot the messenger is the way they put it. And I think what they mean by that is, when you're in a conversation, don't start with a monologue. Don't start with a lecture. We all have those, right? As professors or as intellectuals or as individuals in society, we all in the back of our mind, that lecture that's in the attic of our mind, we're ready to bring it out when needed. And as soon as we think that person needs the lecture, we articulate it. And the point of the book is, when you want to have a conversation with someone, the key is to allow them to actually say what they think. Okay, intentions, which is another good or goal. This, I'm quoting, when you encounter people with radically different beliefs, you might think they are ignorant, crazy, malicious, and so on. Now, we've never done that. We've never listened to a politician and said, what a fill in the blank. We've never listened to the opposing perspective and said, their problem is they're just not as smart as me. They're not as informed. They're biased. I'm not, they are. And so the intentions you bring to a conversation are really important. If you've already written someone off, you're not going to have a conversation. And it's easy when you're around people with whom, or people that are on your side, right? Or come from your perspective. It's easy to be kind. It's easy to be nice. It's easy to be charitable. Why? Because there's no threat. There's no challenge. It's much more difficult when you meet someone who's really smart and has a position that's absolutely opposite of your own. So you can't say they're ignorant. You can't say they're stupid. But we tend to do that. I think the way the book is framing it. Resist, however, this inclination. Instead, consider what the person views from their perspective. In other words, you want to find out why they think the way they do. I find that to be really helpful as a professor. When you finally see where a person's coming from, then you're in a position to perhaps maybe have a real conversation, to have a real dialogue. And then their last point in this book, in their first part of the book, is walk away. And I think that's a shorthand for sometimes the best advice is just to walk away from. I don't mean you say, that's it, I'm leaving. But at some point, you have to have the wisdom to know when the conversation has come to an end. You know, I think the point of the book is not, we're going to get to, we're going to give you successful guidelines that work every time. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes you will find, at least in my perspective in teaching philosophy, you're going to find some people who are really smart who are materialist, and some people really smart who are dualist. And at some point in the literature, there's not closure. There's no last word. They're really good arguments. And when students see this, what it does to them initially is it cripples them, because they say, I don't know what I think. That guy sounds really smart. That woman sounds really smart. They both sound really smart. What do I do? And I say, well, welcome to the real world, in which you have really smart people who disagree, and they have good reasons and good arguments. And then sometimes you have people who, no matter what your arguments are, and I did this the other day in class. I wasn't trying to be a jerk. I don't think I was. It was a philosophy class, and I said to the students, imagine, again, this is part of the book's advice on how to get people to think. You don't threaten their beliefs. You just ask questions. So I said, I'm not telling you this is true, but I said, hypothetically, imagine a world in which the resurrection never happened. Irrefutable evidence, like irrefutable proof that there is no God. And I said, so what would you do? And 3 students raised their hand and said, I would still believe in God. And 1 student said, I would still believe in Jesus. I'd have a personal relationship with Jesus. All along, I'm thinking in my mind, but he's dead. You don't have a relationship with a dead person. And so the point of the book in that respect is sometimes people believe things in spite of the evidence. And my point of that experiment was not to say there isn't a God, there isn't the resurrection. It's an experiment or a guideline in the book, which is to say, sometimes you ask people hypotheticals. Rather than challenging their evidential base, you ask them hypotheticals to say, what would it take for your position to be changed? You know, what would be important? And you let them sort of spell that out. Well, as the students answered my questions, one science major raised his or her hand and said, I wouldn't believe. And as a professor, I thought, I'm not going to take sides. I'm not going to say this position is better than that at this point, because these students have been vulnerable by saying, now in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm with the science student. If the evidence was irrefutable, and I've run this by other people, like, yeah, but how do you know that's good? Irrefutable mean there's no probability. There's no likelihood or less likelihood. It's in fact the case. And what that does is that helps you to see sometimes people are committed to their positions not for good reasons, but because they make them feel comfortable. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong in that, right? Until my comfort zone becomes a basis for assassinating other people or not modifying my worldview or perspective. Okay, so those are the fundamentals of good conversation. Have goals, be collaborative in your conversation, create trust or rapport, learn to listen, try not to deliver too many monologues, have good intentions, think charitably about people, and then learn at some point to back away or walk away if needed. And I think we've all had experiences like that in life, right? Where you go home, you're having Thanksgiving dinner, and lo and behold, an election comes up, and people start articulating some very strong opinions. And before you know it, people start assuming certain things, like you're, a communist or you're a socialist, as though those terms are intrinsically bad, right? That's the assumption. If you were in another context, those would not be bad assumptions. But that's the sort of, mindset, right? If we can, and the point of the book on that is what people are doing is they're assigning moral status to your belief system. They're saying, if you believe X, you're a bad person. And I didn't understand this. It may be my family. I grew up in an Italian family where arguing was kind of a dinner time entertainment, where it had nothing to do with whether we liked each other or didn't. It was just the way we had food together, and you could be so different and disagree. And I never thought, well, that's not, my sister's not my sister now because she's a so-and-so, or my brother. But I do think people feel that way, that they don't want to be accused of being a bad person. And so I hear this a lot. Somebody will say to me, if I believe that, I don't want to be a bad person. And I've never been able to make that association other than that's the way we treat people, I suppose, based on what the book is saying, is we think a worldview and a perspective necessarily makes you a bad person. Now, don't get me wrong. Certain worldviews and perspectives and beliefs can lead to some really bad behavior, right? Where you start annihilating populations of people. So my point is not to say they never come together. But, if somebody's a creationist and somebody's believes in evolution and they're both Christian, I don't think they're bad people because they believe in evolution or creation. I think probably if you listen to people, they mean well. Sometimes they don't. But I think the goal here is to have good intentions, to think charitably of people, to not jump to quick conclusions because somebody has a different worldview or perspective, they're a bad person, or they're a sinister person, or a vicious person. Okay, so all right, if those fundamental goals are important, right? Those are the ones I mentioned. How do we then engage in getting people to reconsider their beliefs? Because we're all going to, let's just be honest. We want that to happen, right? I do. When I'm teaching a class, I want students to learn. And that's a code word for learn to what? Expand their thinking, which means what? They're going to change their mind at some point. And hopefully professors too will be involved in that. And I've had occasions where students and classes, I allow them to come at me and critique me, evaluate me, make arguments. I think I would die of boredom if I went to class and just went on with lectures for hour upon hour. And so how do you get people to reconsider their thoughts, perspectives, worldviews, all that kind of stuff? First thing, it seems to me, is you have to model the behavior you want to see in others. So in other words, don't be a hypocrite, right? Don't call for open-mindedness and not be open-minded in your class. Don't use your education to hide that you sometimes don't know as much as you think you do. So model it, right? Be curious, learn to listen, be fair, have charity, be ready to revise your beliefs and perspectives when needed. Model that for others, I think is their first advice. Words is their second piece of advice. Define up front what you mean. Be clear what you mean exactly when you use words. And in some circles, being an analytic philosopher is a recipe for going to hell, or it's a bad thing. I don't find analytic philosophy to be an inherently bad thing. I think being clear in what you mean and expecting others to do likewise is a virtue. Ask questions, right? Instead of making assumptions, instead of asserting your assumptions, ask people what they mean by what they say. Get them to reconsider. This is their theory of disconfirmation, which is back to the resurrection example I gave. What would be the conditions under which you would say your worldview or belief would go from a 10 to a 5, right? If you were going to sort of numerically give value to that, how would you, in terms of confidence level, would you be more likely or less likely to be a 10, if these considerations were really evaluated, right? So they're not trying to say, the goal is to completely rid people of their beliefs. It's just to say, find ways, ask good questions, so that individuals have the space to really consider in a non-threatening way what they believe or think. And in doing so, seek, and this is, I'm going to be on my soapbox here, seek a nuanced understanding of issues rather than extreme conclusions. It's easy when you're around folks who maybe don't know as much to try to put the really extreme example out there and then assume that's the only way to think. And if you think of political parties, you can imagine the spectrum, right? Where you can, and I swear I've had to stop watching television lately in terms of ads, and I've got bad news. Everyone is guilty, in my estimation, of making things seem easier to believe than they are. If you, and in the book they give examples when liberals and conservatives come together. The problem is we assume they all share the same values. They don't. Conservatives typically are going to say autonomy, right? Liberals are going to tend to speak a bit more about justice. And their whole point is, but you have multiple values that are being articulated. And instead of like bashing one against the other, what you recognize, there's some value in autonomy. There's some value in these particular meta assumptions or intuitions that we have about values. So when you're with someone and you're having a conversation, try to provide the most nuanced understanding of the position that you yourself don't hold. That's one of the things I'm doing this semester. We have debates in my class, and I assign topics to students, and I tell them, you don't have to believe this, you don't have to agree with this, but for the class, you're going to learn to make the best possible case for this position. And if you don't, I'm going to be asking questions. We spent 30 minutes the other day on the relationship between science and religion, as an example. So I asked him, I said, the title of the article is, Are They Compatible? And I said, why would you start out with a question like that? Like, what, is it just obvious? Does this obvious, the word science and religion come with that? And, they shot at me several explanations, well, it's because of this. I said, no, I went through the history of it. I said, no, that's not quite, no, there's more to it, blah, blah, blah. And what they realized in 20 to 30 minutes is what appeared to be a very simple question was a very difficult question. Because we started defining terms, we started clarifying the meaning of particular words. So for example, religion, if science is empirical and religion is not. I was like, well, Christianity starts with the assumption of incarnation, which is based on human observation. Now, we don't observe that currently, right? But there is some sort of an empirical appeal. We touched him, we fellowshipped with him, and then they were, oh, and they thought about it, and we did it. I think we did it in a pretty interesting way. I think what they realized, it's a really hard question. How are science and religion related? And lo and behold, we found out there are 4 different schools of thought on that, right? Conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. And all of those have histories of intellectual dialogue and dispute. So maybe a way to sum this up is, when you're having a conversation, state the position of your interlocutor as well as, if not better, than how they would do so if asked. That's the charitable thing to do, is to make their position the most plausible position you can imagine, and then see if it stands up to scrutiny. Now, I know that doesn't help you politically, I suppose, or rhetorically, if the whole point of your whole motive or intention is to show that your position is right. But if conversation is what you're after, and truth is what you're after, which I think the book says both of those are important, then it seems to me you want the most plausible position with respect to a particular question. Now, again, the book is very idealistic, but I think it's worth considering. The last point. Don't cram facts or evidence down a person's throat. Ask them questions about the conditions under which their beliefs perhaps could be wrong. Don't say they're wrong. Say, what would it take for your position to be reevaluated? If they say nothing, right, then their beliefs are not disconfirmable, okay? They can't be disconfirmed, which means that is to say, they don't think their beliefs are subject to evaluation. And if you find that, I don't know what you say to that person. So in my life, personally, I have met people like that. And what I do now is I realize we have to talk about other things. We have to talk about, the Buffalo Bills, or I don't, whatever. And I'm sure we've all had those experiences, maybe with family. Sometimes you realize there's nowhere to go. They are assuming that there are no conditions under which their beliefs would be amenable or revisable. Which I'll just go ahead and say the only infallible reality or person in my mind is God. Anything else is fallible. So I think anything else is subject to being revisable from my perspective. But you will meet people who I think, when pushed, like when I pushed the question on the resurrection, again, not to say that it didn't happen, but to say if that were the case, you would have to revise your beliefs. And the student's like, no. And so at that point, I just said, okay, this is not about the evidence anymore. It clearly can't be, right? It can't be about the evidence. It can't be about the argument. And I want to say at some point as a human being, respect that, okay? Recognize, I started out coming to church. I was a fundamentalist. And so I know what it's like. I know what it's like to be a fundamentalist. I know what it's like to think that your perspective is right and it's God's perspective. I had a student years ago, I won't mention he was related to a fairly prominent person within the conservative side of Churches of Christ, came to me at the end of the class and said, Dr. Aquino, thank you for listening to me. And I thought, well, that's strange. I hope I listen to all students. And he said, no, I've been shot down in class because I'm conservative. And I said, all I care about is you're capable of making arguments. If you can make a good argument, then that's the key, whether you're a conservative or a liberal. And then lo and behold, he starts sending me things he wants me to give him feedback and critique. And I thought, this is cool. Like, I didn't ask for it, but I think what he experienced in a class was a professor who was willing to hear out a perspective that in other places would have been shot down. Now, don't get me wrong, I've made mistakes, plenty of them. I wanted to give an example from my own life where I've experienced what I thought would have been a very difficult thing, which is a person from that perspective who would have felt very comfortable articulating a more conservative perspective. All right, so conclusion. The book ends with a chapter on engaging the most challenging interlocutors of all, ideologues. These, according to the book, these are people that think they're morally superior. They're right. They're not only right, but they're good. And they're not only good, they're better than you. These are the individuals, and just bad news for all of us, they're on the left and the right and in the middle. They come in various shapes and forms and worldviews and perspectives. It's not just conservatives or liberals. I don't even think it's specific to a worldview necessarily. I think this is just individuals who feel like you're beneath them intellectually and morally. For them, conversations must take place on a moral rather than a factual plane, because subscribing to certain beliefs is a test of being virtuous. And if you don't believe me, just read around. Look on particular campuses now. Hence, quote, we should acknowledge their intention and affirm their identity as good. Now that's hard, right? When you meet an ideologue, a real ideologue, they're saying we should in any conversation start out with the premise that these individuals mean well, rather than the assumption they're bad people. Why? Because you've just contradicted yourself, right? You just critiqued an ideologue for being self-righteous, and you're doing the same thing. You're assuming from the get-go they must be really bad people, because I think in some ways that makes us feel better that their position is wrong, right? Well, what if their position, let me put it this way, what if their position is correct? Like, what if intellectually they're saying the right thing? They're just a-holes, you know? And I've met people like this, right? They're really smart and they're jerks, or they're self-righteous. But the point of the book is we should try to start out with great intentions. So we all start out with some perspective. We all have some sort of ideological perspective, I presume. However, we have to realize when we encounter people that we want to at least initially start out with the assumption that maybe they mean well. So a possible risk, however, reading this book, and I'm sure when I read it, you know, it's easy to read it and go, oh yeah, that's great. That's right. That works. A possible risk is we might come away from this book thinking that it was written for my interlocutor, not for me. And it ends by saying, you now have the tools to speak your mind, understand, and be understood. You're empowered to navigate even the most difficult conversations. That's on page 179. We might feel empowered to seek out and level our ideological enemies with these newfound skills and habits of mind. However, if that's the case, we've missed the point of the book. The point of the book is not merely to observe our interlocutors. It's actually, in light of what I said last time, it's trying to figure out whether our point of departure is beginning with our own self-evaluation rather than just our conversation partner. Sure, we want to have the conditions under which a conversation can happen. We want that to be on the table. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a self-evaluation in and through our particular beliefs and our particular actions and our particular self-evaluation. It means, if we really truly love wisdom, that we will act in accordance with what we perceive to be the truth. We will figure out whether what we believe and think tracks with the world outside of our mind or our thoughts and our desires. Just because we feel a certain way does not mean that it is necessarily legitimate or veridical. It may be. But I think the point of the book is this is a strategy for everyone, right? For our interlocutors, but also for ourselves. So it's not a perfect book. There's some things technically that I would want to think about. If I were in an epistemology seminar, there might be some things I would want to point out, but I thought for today's conversation, for what Jerry asked me to do, we would focus a bit more on their strategy. And I think it's a good start. Now, my advice to you, if you watch them on YouTube, they are not oblivious to or exempt from using profanity or speaking very directly and clearly in a way that could be construed as being offensive. I don't think they intend to be offensive. I think they're calling out, in some ways, the culture now in which we're protecting ourselves from one another by throwing out labels or accusing people of bad motives or bad intentions. So in encouraging you to read this book, I don't want to, back to my earlier point, I don't want to claim any responsibility for their personal moral lifestyle. I don't know them personally, but I would say evaluate the book on the terms that it was written. It was written as a book on how to have conversations. So I think I'll stop there.
Dr. Aquino, thank you so much. There are some questions that we're gonna toss your way. This one came in, and then they felt that it was partially answered, but I still want to give it so you can expound on it a little bit.
Sure.
Um, when might it be appropriate, if possible, to establish boundaries or uses of dialogue when the other party tends to not operate under the same virtues or tends to monologue? Is disengaging from conversations wrong? This person says they're asking for a friend, so I'll be the friend.
Well, I'm trying to find, there's a point in the book where they actually, yeah, here it is. Hold on a second, page 50, where they actually, and I don't know what anyone thinks about this, and I certainly would love to hear from anyone about this. But they basically say avoid combative conversations on social media. So first thing they I think they believe is not that social media is inherently bad, but, and I have witnessed this firsthand, uh, it seems easy for people on social media to make some really strong comments, and then you get likes and dislikes. I don't think social media is as conducive to conversation as what the authors have in mind. And so, not to say that you can't ever have social media discussion, you can't have discussion in print, but I think what they're envisioning is trying to create and cultivate discussions within a face-to-face kind of encounter with ground rules that are established over time. And gaining trust is not going to be something that happens overnight. So I think with those provisions in mind, I would say don't jump to quick conclusions, but there may be times where even when the ground rules are established, you just have to say, you know, because the point of the book is not, here's how to win, right? Here's how to be right. I mean, they certainly think it's important to get to the truth, but I think what they're diagnosing in this book is our current context, which is, okay, let me get a show of hands, maybe a thumbs up. How many of you watched the presidential debate? How many of you watched the vice presidential debate? I have to look away from the TV, and I mean on both sides. And I'm some are more guilty than others, but the nonverbals, the smiling, the mocking, those are not conducive to, in my mind, those aren't conducive to dialogue. Those are reactionary. And so what I think they're recommending in this book is not easy, because I think we are so used to what I would say the sort of rhetorical effect. And when some politicians are asked later on, but you said X, Y, and Z 15 years ago, so it was a debate. And my point is, look, you can change your mind, but hopefully you're not saying this just because it's a debate, right? Hopefully it's actually a policy. Hopefully it's a perspective that you hold. And again, people can change their minds. But I think what's happening now is we're more focused on the effect of dialogue rather than starting back to where it should start, which is the internal formation of the people. So I don't have any like quick answer for what to do, and I'd have to know the situation. But there's certainly going to be times where if somebody's not following the agreed upon rules or whatever you want to call those, at some point you probably have to sort of say, okay, I think it's time to go. It's time to, because it's not gonna go very well. As the debates, I mean, I've many people, and again, I'm trying not to take sides. I have my own particular perspective. My wife and I have a rule during the debates: we don't talk, we don't look at one another, and we don't make comments. Now, we've never been perfect about that. There's an occasional looking at it. I've been married for 30 years, so my wife, we love each other. We don't always agree, but I wish people were more inclined to respect protocol. And I think we don't have good examples of that right now in public. I think we have really suspect examples.
So in the time that we exist in right now, it's often, I think, in my experience on my university campus, that individuals want to come and have dialogues, but they're not prepared to are equipped to actually have some form of discussion. They're not, they, if we truly interrogate the things that they're pulling out, they really don't know what they believe or which side of any type of argument they're on. What is the job of, or the responsibility of individuals that at least have a deeper level of capability to help individuals tease that out inside of these discussions versus trying to pull them over to your side? What is the responsibility to help them pull out their full understanding of what they're even saying?
Yeah, well, I'll just apply it to education. I think the goal of every educator should be to enable people to graduate from their professor, so that when they leave, so Mark Weeb, who was a student of mine, when we get together now, Mark's in a position to critique me and evaluate me, and we're very good friends. I love Mark, he's a great guy. But if it's done well, right, if it's done carefully, it shouldn't be a kind of social dependence where they continue to look to you as the person with all the answers. But I think universities need to incorporate in their, from the get-go, first day of class, first day of school. I told Phil Schubert this the other day, we need to have a class in critical thinking. We need students to know what it is. And I know we have some of that. We used to have it in core, we have it in philosophy class. I'm talking about early and right away, where students understand what it means to make an argument, what it means to evaluate evidence, what it means to, and that we have to have mentors. We have to have professors who model that in class, who don't play to their own perspective. Because it's easy, right? If you're in a class and students don't know as much, it's easy to get away with stuff. That's why I love team teaching, because it holds you accountable as in front of students, to recognize even professors are going to change their perspective, and maybe sometimes they're not fair, right? Hopefully most of the times we're fair, but there has to be in place. You know, we talk a lot about things being systemic. There has to be in place a system in which people learn to not only read, but observe good arguments, good protocol. And I think outside of class, professors need to spend time, because I think students, you'll find out quickly, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in their lives. Some of it's intellectual, some of it's not. Some of it's family related. And you have to be able to recognize at some point, the student may not be responding for reasons entirely other than the ones that you think they have in their toolkit. And so that would be my advice. Mentoring, and it's an overused word, but I mean real mentoring in which people are learning to negotiate. And I use that term not in a sort of advantageous way. They're learning to, as I say to students sometimes, when you go home and you've learned all this stuff at ACU, don't take it out on your parents. Don't come home and say to your parents, did you know? I mean, you know, mess with your parents who haven't been in school for a long time and maybe didn't study this particular theory. That's not the point of education. It's not to make people feel bad about themselves, right? But that's got to be modeled. They have to see. I've learned this the hard way. They have to see what you're talking about. They have to be able to see what it looks like to be a critical thinker, because sometimes they think critical thinking means you think everyone's wrong, or you think this perspective's wrong. This means you're now stepping back and evaluating assumptions and beliefs, including your own, right? And if you're doing justice to the subject, you don't exempt yourself. So how to do that in a classroom, how to do that in high school, I'd love to see that more. And I think it's happening on some level, but to be more deliberate and to have concrete practices in which students, if we were in COVID, one of the things we do, Mike Doherty and I do, is we have public debates where we assign topics to students in groups of 5, and they all have to make a case for the particular position, and they all have to sit up there in front of the class, and they have to take feedback from their fellow classmates. They have to respond to the other side of the table and the whole classroom. And I think what they begin to see is maybe firsthand what it's like to be a professor up there looking at the class. Because usually they're in the seats looking at the professor, but they get to see now what it's like to be up there and how hard it is, right? And how intimidating it can be. And so maybe giving some examples like that as starters would be a great great way to go for universities. And I think some of them are doing that, but I think I'm talking across the board. No discipline gets exempt. If you're a science major, or you're a Bible major, an English major, you name it, you all have to learn how to do critical thinking, no matter the discipline.
Question came in. How would you and how should we apply this information to our spiritual think tanks? How should we use this to guide us deeper into spiritual analysis and moving down that path?
Well, I think this shows the genius of Jerry Taylor, that at least in conversations with him, the easy thing to do right now in our culture is to go for surface level conversations, the low hanging fruit, the easy stuff, and to sort of critique it. But I think the more substantial thing is to do exactly what I mentioned last time, which is to, in an interior fashion, to really check ourselves at the door to figure out what our desires are, what our thoughts are, and to find ways in which the think tank can engage in that kind of self-evaluation, both individually and collectively. So that when let me put it this way, when you go out into the real world and you encounter people who may not play according to the rules, you have to ask yourself, am I going to be overwhelmed by the moment? Am I going to be overwhelmed by the craziness? Am I going to be overwhelmed by the quick assumptions? Am I going to sit back and be able to reflect on my thinking, my desires, and do that likewise with respect to others? And I think in conversations with Jerry, I mean, if he had it his way, he'd be on the streets praying and meeting with people and trying to figure out not only what's going on politically, but what's going on spiritually. And you're going to need, at some point, I know we're in the free church tradition, you're going to need some spiritual mentors or directors. You're going to need some individuals who've done this a lot longer than most of us to be able to be there and to be able to have the wisdom and discernment to see what's really going on and to see a very sophisticated, complex problem. I think we all know this, right? When we look at what's going on in the world and we say, oh, it's this one thing. I say run for the hills when you hear somebody say that. It's not one thing. It's a very complicated thing. And then you got to figure out the right people who are going to help you to size up the situation, both politically and spiritually. And if I take spirituality to be, I'm assuming Jerry takes it to be this, if I take it to be being led by the Spirit, that means you have to be ready to be aligned with that kind of openness to God and the world. So it's one thing to write about spirituality and to talk about it. It's another to actually have it in very concrete ways mapped out, like John Cassian in the Institutes. He has instruction for fellow monks on how to live the spiritual life. So something like that might be interesting, Jerry, and anyone else, to start thinking about literature that you might think would be helpful to both those within the spiritual think tank, and those who perhaps might be outside of it. You're going to have to divide the labor. You're going to have a lot of different people helping out, and have some people who can do astute political analysis, have some people who can do astute theological analysis, astute philosophical analysis, you name it. I mean, get the right people to help you do that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. Seeing some head nods. Last one that came in. As for the question about viewing the debate, there is news everywhere on the candidates. So why would one not try to listen to them presenting their case and be a little more informed?
If I was heard to say don't watch debates, I'm not. That's not my point. My point is, if you were to just evaluate content, I would have loved to hear more about policies in the first debate. Real laying out of policies, a lot of interrupting, a lot of what I would call rude behavior. And Chris Wallace, who's a really good moderator, I think never anticipated that. So yes, I absolutely, you should pursue as much as you possibly can what people are trying to articulate. But my point, I think, is it's getting harder and harder to do that in terms of the distractions. And this is what we teach students to do, right? We teach them to learn how to evaluate arguments, to pay attention, to be charitable. And I'm not seeing that demonstrated necessarily by public officials always. There's always a sort of a threatening word that, you know, if you watch the campaign ads, you know, if you vote for this person, the world's going to come to an end. We're going to become fill in the blank. If you vote for that person, and I want to say we need a more educated public who will be not overwhelmed by, and will see things for what they really are. And what's troubling to me is, again, I could be wrong. I think the people that are making these decisions assume we have a fairly low level of ability to actually assess arguments. If you just pay attention to the distractions and the not answering questions, you name it, like, will you release X, Y, and Z? Won't answer the question. Are you fill in the blank? You know, I'm trying not to point to particular, you know, presidential candidates here, but they were asked very, very straightforwardly questions, and several times Chris Wallace had to say, no, stop. You know, and respect time limits, respect that, you know, don't start out and going over time. So I don't have a real easy solution other than, you know, we need better examples of how to have public discussion or conversation than what we're currently getting. And I don't care, name a network. They're going to start appealing to at some point, your emotions. They're going to start appealing to, you know, some sort of empathy, which is not a bad thing. But at some point, I want to know the content of what this particular, I want to know the particular policies that this individual is committed to. That's going to help me make an informed decision, right? If you want to know something about the next presidential candidate. So I absolutely listen to the debates. I'm just saying, I think I was depressed, I'll say, after the first one.
Is there a way we can truly connect through conversations with white supremacists?
Say that again?
Yeah. Is there a way we can truly connect through conversations with white supremacists?
I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, I guess you would do what the book says, right? You would try, and there's a guy that's actually doing this. I forgot his name. He's referred to in this book, where he actually goes and he becomes friends with these individuals and gets them to unpack their own worldview. And I don't know much about it, but I know he's done that. I forgot his name now, Daryl something. But I would say, you know, apply this book as much as you would apply to any other topic. And I would probably want to say, get clear on what people mean by that expression, white supremacy. Be clear on what people actually mean by that, because I think in the literature there are wide ranging of meanings that are attached to that particular expression. But I can't imagine that you would not apply the book in the same way. Now I don't know what kind of success you're going to have at it, but you open up the door for people to be clear on what it is that they're actually trying to say. Why do they think that way?
As we wait for other questions to come in, I have one that I want to toss out there, which is, at what point do we get into, I would say, some trouble with the ability to have thoughtful and, I say, to some extent efficient, but also moving forward, like kind of true conversations, true dialogue. in the face of anti-intellectualism, right? Like at what point are we kind of saying, okay, we before we can have healthy conversations, we actually have to fight a battle against folks just not wanting to deal in a space of intellectual rigor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the bigger worry I have is I'm told on a regular basis that when I raise questions about intellectual issues, we're not in the university. Let's get practical, which I think is a bunch of nonsense. I think there are decisions that are being made within structures right now that have deep intellectual ties and reasoning, whether they're utilitarian or whatever particular philosophical school. So I think I guess I agree with your assumption that if any intellectualism is a challenge, which I think it is, we have to find ways to get people to see that ideas do matter. And they do have practical consequences, and they do. And I think what's happened is we've only looked at the consequence, right? Only. But I would want people to see what it is that's actually, and maybe even back to the earlier question about white supremacy, what are the reasons or the ideas that are supporting a perspective like that? And if you can disentangle those, right, in a non-threatening way and get people to see what those are and evaluate them, and again, in a way that you're not, and it's going to be hard, right? You're not saying necessarily they're rotten people, they're despicable, I don't ever want to, you at some point, you have to affirm even those individuals are creating the image of God, right? At some point, you have to affirm that. Then you have to sort of spell out, hopefully help them, or maybe they can do it themselves, spell out what it is, why they feel that way. And there's a really good movie on this with Forrest Whitaker in it recently, where he's an African-American minister and meets a white supremacist. It's based on a real story. And he gets to know this guy, and I mean, I want to go through all the details, but I mean, getting to find out why people think the way they do and seeing the intellectual aspects of it, the reasons, I think is really crucial and really important. And stop bad-mouthing the life of the mind and stop bad-mouthing. Universities sometimes are out to lunch. I'm not saying they're never, but I think there are politically, theologically, philosophically worldviews that are embedded in the structures that we have.
Two came in. Can you comment on the role of niceness in preventing authentic dialogue in congregations? Do you agree with that? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on what we mean by not being nice, right? I grew up in upstate New York, and if I'm too direct, somebody will say I'm not a really nice person. If you're indirect, you're a nice person. And I just think that's not true. I'm not sure being direct or indirect makes you a nice or a bad person. But if by being nice means, that you're being considerate, you're thinking about what somebody's actually saying, then I think err on the side of being nice. Now, there was another part of the question there, I think. What was you read that again, Byron?
It was just the role of niceness in authentic dialogue in congregations.
Yeah, I mean, if this is the point of the book, right, is if a person feels like they're really being heard, and again, maybe this would apply to white supremacy, that's the one that's maybe the more difficult one. But if people feel like they really are being heard and they're not being marginalized, and I think that can go in multiple directions, right? That you can do that with multiple perspectives. You can marginalize people, whoever's in power now is going to marginalize the opposition, right? So if you're nice, by that I take it to mean that you're going to give a person space to really think out loud in a safe way. I don't see why churches wouldn't err on the side of being nice. If being nice means not saying what you really think, then I would say get rid of being nice. Because at some point, we want to know what people really think. We want to know what you really think. And again, I'm not taking a shot at being politically correct or not. That's not my point. I'm simply saying being nice better not be a code word for a cultural assumption of, because like I said, I grew up in a family where eating dinner together and going at it was not a bad thing. And my parents are the nicest people in the universe. They're really good people. But if you meet my dad, he's going to tell you what he thinks, and he's going to say it in a way that's pretty straightforward. I don't think that makes him a bad person. I don't think that necessarily makes him a nice person, depending on what we mean by nice. So if nice means being considerate of other perspectives and allowing people the space to air what they think, then I say churches should be nice. They should be nice people. But I also know sometimes churches will speak out on things and somebody will say, you're not being nice because you're taking a stance. I'm going to say it has nothing to do with it. You could be a really nice person and still have a conviction about a particular issue. I don't think your conviction makes you a bad person or a nice person. You have nice people who think some really good things and probably sometimes think some squirrely things. I've met nice people who think some, at times, what I consider to be not always rational perspectives or coherent perspectives, but I wouldn't say that makes them nice or not so nice. So I would say churches should be nice. They should love their neighbors. They should love their enemies. They should care for the poor. They should do all these great things. But there may be a place for being nice and also hashing it out, right? And that would be ideal, right? You have nice people who disagree and do it in a very sane and charitable and wonderful way. But too many times we use nice as a sort of conversation stopper. I mean, who wants to be called the guy that's not nice, or the person that's not nice? And if somebody says, "Well, you're not being really nice," what's the likelihood that you're going to speak up some more when they say that? Very little, right? Because you've just been talked off the conversation table or out of it or away from it.
It's a kind of a follow to that. Somebody asked, as the body of Christ on the topic of white supremacy, have you seen the principles of this book accomplished amongst us locally, regionally, nationally, or globally?
That's a really good question, and it's Byron. It's okay. Helps me make sense of the earlier question that you asked about anti-intellectualism, and I'm not going to generalize because I've not been to every church. I will say this from my experience being a philosophy professor and going to church, I do think at times there's a discrimination against people who teach philosophy or teach something outside of the Bible. Watch out for those guys. And they quote Paul, beware of those vain philosophers. They don't read Acts 17, where Paul actually has a dialogue with Epicureans and Stoics, and they don't read that very carefully, where he doesn't quote scripture at all in that sermon or whatever it is. So I do think there is an insularity problem in churches sometimes, where there are people that go to church not sure what they think about God, and they're told, don't go and talk to the minister, or don't talk, because you don't want to be blackballed, you don't want to be viewed as a troublemaker. I think it's high time for churches to stop insulating themselves from the world. There are going to be times where church is going to speak out against culture. I have no problem with that. But I think there are going to be times where the larger culture may be actually helpful in informing churches again, you have to be careful because of the government that you don't turn the church into some political organization. You have to be really careful. There are guidelines, IRS guidelines. But I do think sometimes a kind of anti-intellectualism creeps into our discourse, dressed up as piety, dressed up as believing in the Bible. And I see this firsthand with students when they come to school and they take science classes, and now they have to think for themselves. They have to be able to put a lot of things together. I pray that churches and universities will be better at having robust conversations and relationships where they trust each other. Especially those who claim to have a connection with the church, that we're not out to destroy people. We're not out to take shots at the church. We actually are just trying to help people to make a connection between their faith and a whole range of topics or disciplines or ideas. So I won't give an F to the church. That's not my business. I will just say, I think ministers need to foster greater conversations with intellectuals, and intellectuals need to do likewise. And these guys, I mean, Boghossian, he wrote a book. So again, he's got a perspective. He wrote a book, How to Make People Atheists. So I mean, he's not shying away from those conversations. So we need to find ways in church to encourage people to not see critical thinking as anti-spiritual. I think it could be an extension of spirituality, learning to be critical.
Thank you. Last few questions here. Do you see any relationship between the practices outlined here and, I might mispronounce this philosopher's name, but Buber's philosophy?
Oh, Martin Buber, the author of I Thou. I have a friend, Paul Moser, who's actually written several books, and I think for him, the I Thou relationship is really important to conversations, because I think they don't, obviously they're not theists, they're not going to appropriate that, but I think they have what I would call a borderline secular version of something like that, where you don't see the individual there as merely an object, right, that you fill with information, but they actually are another human being. And so that I-thou relationship is important to creating trust, to creating a robust environment in which people feel like, A, they're being heard, B, real conversations are happening. And so there's no explicit connection there, but I think you can make that connection as well. And in fact, I would argue from a Christian point of view, the reason why you have these discussions with other human beings is that you believe they are created in the image and likeness of God. And you believe you have that. And the book later actually brings this out. Even when you disagree, right, politically on perspectives, there may be some overlap in terms of some things that we all would take for granted, right? That a person is more important than your perspective. We say that until it's clear that this person disagrees with me, and then you're like, well, maybe they're not really a person. And we know where that goes, right? We know when we start saying that particular groups are not full persons, how pernicious that is, how problematic. So at some point, as a Christian, you better have some notion of how you're connected to this individual that may repulse you, right, in terms of their worldview or their perspective. And that's probably what Jerry was thinking when we talk, when you think of maybe some of the greats like King, is that there is this fundamental commitment to the well-being of the other person, even when their worldview or perspectives are deeply problematic. So there should be some similarity there between the I-thou perspective of Buber and what we're saying today.
I'll finish with this last question. Is there ever a point where we as Christians maybe should not start with a conversation?
Could that person give me an example of what they're asking, or is it too late to do that?
Since it's me that's asking it.
Oh, you're asking it. Oh, okay. Well, Byron, would you maybe give me a concrete example? It would be helpful. Maybe give me an example that would illustrate your point, maybe, perhaps.
Standing at a protest with a group of students and being engaged by some counter protesters, sitting in the middle between them and the students, the question was, okay, hey, let's just call it quits. Is that a time where we can house a conversation or move folks into a dialogue? And is that a point where we should use these tools to really help maybe stop some conflict? Or is that a time to maybe think differently?
Well, Jerry gave me an example of this. I think it was in Kentucky, right? You want to share that example, Jerry? There was an example of, I think, what you're describing.
Refresh my memory just a little bit more. I know we've been in dialogue with.
There was, yeah, you said there was some potential violence that was going to pursue between groups. And
yeah, it was the most fascinating thing. There were armed white people with weapons marching to the same location where you had Black protesters, and some of them were armed. And it looked as if the second Civil War, race war, actually was going to break out at that moment in Louisville, Kentucky. And so the person that was filming it was having a conversation describing what was escalating, and just praying all the time that something would happen to divert it. Well, when they actually got together, the leader of the white group started having a conversation with the leaders of the Black group, and they engaged each other. It was a little heated there at first, but then they ended up kind of merging together and left peacefully. And so I just wish the media had caught hold of that. I think it was a private citizen that filmed that. But if we could have seen that as an example lifted up before the whole country, that would have given a lot of people hope that in the midst of this heated climate, it is possible for people to break through the clamoring and all of the chaos, and to actually end up in the same space at the same time, armed with weapons, that people would prevail with better minds to talk it out, and to see that they're not against each other, but there's this other element that's benefiting from all of this chaos and clashing. And so they actually had that conversation. I was able to overhear it, and was the most fascinating thing that I've seen in a while.
And maybe to add to that, I think when you watch the media coverage of a lot of stuff, what you end up seeing is a lot of violence, a lot of yelling, and I'm not sure in that particular setting how you're going to create a conversation. I think you have to get to the leadership structure, hopefully, individuals, and create, probably not in that setting actually, create opportunities for a real exchange. And I think that it illustrates the point, that maybe not just of this book. In fact, I wouldn't, Byron would say, hey, look at this book, let's have a discussion. You probably need to find ways in which you can start networking with these the particular leader structures. I watched a recent one between Hawk, what's his last name from Black Lives Matter, and Candace Owens. I watched it, and there are people like, why did you watch that? Why did you watch Candace Owens? And I watched them. They talked for about an hour, and I can't remember. It was very, very straightforward question and answer, where I think they didn't pull away from their perspectives. They actually, somebody told me you should watch it, so I watched it. It was okay, but it was an interesting illustration of what happens when somebody's actually trying to listen. And there were points where he jumped in and corrected her. There were points where she pushed back and tried to correct him in a way that I thought, again, it's not perfect. And again, my point is not, I'm endorsing either of those. It's maybe an illustration of what happens when in a fairly civil way, people are allotted the space. And I think she invited him on her show. And they sat, right across from one another. And it was certainly, they didn't back away from their perspectives, but at least I got to hear their perspective, right? I got to hear what they actually, their reasoning, and her reasoning for why she's an African American Republican, or I think a Trump supporter, and why her interlocutor is not. But what made that conversation possible was not that they were that one was a Republican, one was a Democrat, was the willingness to actually extend the conversation in a charitable way. And again, not knowing where that's going to go. If we can create those kinds of opportunities, finding out the individuals who are within the leadership structure, that would be helpful. But what I've seen, again, I haven't gone to the protests in these cities, so I don't know, other than what the media is trying to communicate. I don't know how suitable those environmental situations are for what we're describing.
Oh, thank you for that. I think this has been really, really beneficial, and I thank you so much for taking time to engage us with this book, with this text. Everyone, I just tossed Dr. Aquino's information into the chat. Please, if you have other questions, please reach out to Dr. Aquino. I know personally he's more than willing to engage in this healthy dialogue and this exchange.
This is my office. This is St. John Coltrane and St. Miles Davis in the corner there, if you're wondering. Those are my two posters. And thanks for having me. I hope what I said today made sense. I think the questions were really wonderful. There's a lot more to be said. And I really just want to say again to the group, I really appreciate what you're doing. Please don't lose hope. Please be praying for guidance. And if I can be helpful in any other ways, you let me know, because I support what you're up to. And I've been telling my friends, some of my friends, Billy Abraham and some others about this, and they're encouraged by what you're trying to do. So what you're doing is not in vain, is a long way of saying. And I'm deeply honored by your courage and your maturity. And like I said, don't be a stranger if you have any questions or even objections. If you're like, I'm not sure about that, I will not run from that. I would enjoy. I've had already a phone conversation with somebody as a result of this, and it's been a really fruitful conversation. And if I may say this, to the younger crowd here today, I want to strongly encourage you not to lose hope, to not see the moment as the defining moment, to have the wisdom to see beyond what's going on right now without ignoring what's going on, because it's easy to become discouraged, apathetic, hopeless. And if I might preach for just a second, we have hope in our God, who provides, but we also need to see what that means in our particular context. So thanks for your time on a Saturday, and for all that you brought to the conversation.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Aquino. The Carl Spain Center on Race Studies and Spiritual Action has a few more events coming up in this month. Next week, next Saturday, just a week from today, we're going to be virtually with our hearts and our minds and our spirits. We're going to be in Minneapolis, Minnesota for the virtual Racial Unity Leadership Summit. The link, I have just tossed the link right into the chat. Sign up. It's virtual, so you don't have to go to Minnesota, which is good, because I was just talking to my mother-in-law who said it was snowing already. You get to keep yourself from the snow, but we can be there in spirit and actually talk and unpack this. So please go and sign up for that. Right now, I'll toss it over to Dr. Taylor for any closing comments.
Thank you, Byron, and thank you, Dr. Aquino, very much. This is the kind of work that is going to take. We have to keep at it, even if we don't have sensationalism going on in the media. We have to continue to do the grunt work. People ask the question, well, what can I do to help bring about healing in this country in terms of race? What we can do is spend time as wisely as we spend our money, and not to spend time addressing these hot button issues, especially in terms of race. We will end up spending more time in the long run than we would have when times are at some seminal amount of peace. So we have to continue using time and addressing these matters. And I appreciate Dr. Aquino for taking time to be with us, and for you all taking time out of your Saturday afternoon to be here to reason together. That's what this is. We have to reason together. Otherwise, we're going to spiral out of out of control because we will begin to engage in unreasonable activity. So thank you again. I appreciate your presence here today virtually, and let's continue to pray that God will continue to guide us and to hear our cries one more time for peace and for justice and for harmony to reign in the land like it has never done before. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'll toss it back to Byron. He can lead us in our closing prayer, and hopefully we'll see you next Saturday at the Minneapolis Racial Unity Leadership Summit, treating the root of racism. There will be a lot of interesting topics from the book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and also we'll be dealing with our kind of people. Bobby Green will be addressing that topic. And there'll be several others, another book called White Rage, another book called Black Rage, and we're going to discuss all of that. And so please make plans to join us, and also bring other people. We ought to try to get as many people to be in the presence of this kind of information that is being made available, so that we can really be the salt of the earth and light of the world wherever we might live. So thank you again. Byron, back to you.
Yeah. Well, thank y'all for being here today. I'll pray us out and then we'll be dismissed. Pray with me, please. Most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you at this time. Just thank you for all your wisdom and grace, Lord. Thank you for being a God that sees us and loves us in spite of ourselves, in spite of our hang-ups and mess-ups. You still see that we are valuable and we have a place with you, Lord. And you call us to this wonderful thing called reconciliation, Lord. And we just pray that you give us the courage to seek after you through reconciliation, Lord. We know that one of the things that we have to do is we have to sacrifice ourselves, Lord. So we pray that you give us courage as we do this work, Lord. Thank you for your servant and leading all of us in this, Dr. Jerry Taylor. Thank you for his wisdom that you continue to give to him. Lord, we thank you also for fellow servant, Dr. Fred Aquino, and his wisdom that he shared today, Lord. Thank you for everybody that's on this call and everybody that'll hear this. We ask that they be blessed and will be guided closer to a relationship with you because of their time here today. All these things we ask in Christ Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Man. See yourself dismissed. Thank you so much.